I'm Stacy Cole, the president of the Coastal Georgia Genealogical Society, and welcome to our program today. Before I introduce Terry and Adolphus, let me take a minute for some housekeeping. We are located in the Brunswick, Georgia area on the coast, but we're still virtual. So our next meeting will be virtual. It will be Sunday, March 12th. We're just going to chat about what we learned at RootsTech. We're having our first in-person event on March 25th, which will be a guided tour of the Moore Methodist Museum and Research Library on St. Simons Island. And you can find information about those and future programs on our website. Our programs are open to all, but membership does help us keep going. It's only $10 a year, and the information to join is on our website. I'm going to drop a link into the chat shortly for a handout that has contact information for Terry, Adolphus, and me, and links to local websites and Facebook pages that might be of interest to you. If you have a question that we don't have time to deal with this afternoon, please feel free to use the contact information. Today, we're here to chat about finding African-American family networks in coastal Georgia via DNA and records. This is going to be an informal chat. I'll ask some questions to start off with, and questions from the audience are encouraged. You can put your questions in the chat. Terry and Adolphus, who are both CGGS members, thank you very much, and governing members of Ujima Genealogy in Coastal Georgia, are here today to answer your questions. Adolphus is a co-founder of the Low Country Georgia DNA Project, and he'll tell you more about that. Sorry, I'm just doing some muting. He'll tell you more about that project and the urgent need to test community elders before it's too late. Terry is also a co-founder of the project, and she is the Front Porch Genealogist. In fact, you may have heard about today's meeting through her newsletter. Both Adolphus and Terry have deep roots in coastal Georgia, though they don't live here now, and both have been researching this area for quite a long time. I'm going to be moderating the discussion today, so I'll just tell you that I'm a descendant of enslavers from Liberty County, Georgia, and I devote most of my research time to my website, theyhadnames.net, which is a compilation of records naming African Americans in mostly antebellum Liberty County records. So, Terry and Adolphus, let me start by first thanking you for being here and welcoming you. And let me start off by asking about your connections, your family connections to coastal Georgia, and how your research morphed into a much wider scope of researching entire families and communities in the area.
Okay, well, well, first of all, I was actually, is there, did we drop? Okay. Well, you want to go first?
No, I was going to say, you're fine. We can hear you perfectly.
Okay. All right, because I keep hearing these blips. But, well, first of all, I was actually raised in Europe, but I have very, very deep roots in Georgia. I come from a very long line. Basically, I remember. Yeah. But basically, my father is from McIntosh County. My mother is from Chatham County. And what I found in my research is that their roots extend right across and tie into the general arc of history for coastal Georgia. And so among them, I'm finding Scottish Highlanders, the patriots of the Revolutionary War, Black and white. I'm finding enslaved Africans that were trafficked through the Caribbean before landing in the Carolinas, the Chesapeake Bay area, all through the South, whether it's Florida, Indian territories of Alabama and Mississippi. So I consider myself a coastal Georgian through and through, even though I've never resided there, but all roads lead right back to the Georgia coast.
Okay, hi everyone. Again, Stacy, thank you for that wonderful welcome. Again, my name is Adolphus Armstrong, and I actually grew up in McIntosh County on the north end of the county, which we locals call the Cannon Bluff area. And effectively how I got started really doing my research is that at towards the end of the late 90s, my grandmother started to become ill. And a lot of people would start to visit, and then people would just start to pop in and say, hey, cousin, cousin. And after a while, I started to notice that this is my paternal grandmother. And some of the people that were on my maternal side were popping in saying cousin. And so I had to, like, you know, write some names down to figure out, okay, wait a minute. I know I'm related to this person on my mother's side of the family. Why is this person coming to visit my paternal grandmother and calling her cousin? So starting, you know, down that road in that process, you come to realize that you have people that are related on both sides. And as I started digging in, I realized that both sides, you know, came back in and merged in. So one of those double cousin situations where you do some research and you figure out, well, lo and behold, my parents are related to each other. There you go. But again, you know, it's something that happened. And so I'm just glad that I'm here with 10 toes, 10 fingers, and everything appears to work at this point. And again, during that time, towards the late 90s, that's when I had a chance to start to interview some of the seniors in the local neighborhood. And I happened on cousin Arthur DeVerger one day, and he said, well, why are you asking me all these questions? Go talk to that gal down there in Florida. She has all the information. And I'm just making my notes. Okay, gal in Florida, follow up. And then ultimately, the gal in Florida turned out to be our own front porch genealogist, Terry Ward. So I gave her a call out of the blue. She's, you know, at that point, you know, she was definitely, you know, in Orlando. Say, hey, I'm cousin so-and-so. Can we meet up? And she said, sure, come on over. And so I jumped in my car, and we've been thick as thieves ever since. And so that really got started in terms of trying to document that extended family network. And with the advent of DNA, it has really helped, you know, create such a wide net. And as we've been doing the paper research, coupling that with the DNA has just been such a fantastic piece of it in terms of the two of them work well together in terms of helping to explain some of the things that you're seeing in the records. And in addition to that, for the stories to get passed down, people, you'll interview a senior and someone will talk about, you know, cousin Ida, and you're making your notes. It's like, how you make, and you try to figure out how does cousin Ida fit in, and it doesn't resonate immediately, but 2-3 years down the road, you start to see a tree and you see a DNA match. There's cousin Ida sitting at the top of someone else's tree. So I can't really impress, you know, how DNA has really kind of helped, you know, put those two together. So what we've been doing is making a conscious effort to make an attempt to try and get, you know, some of our seniors tested, because that DNA, as cousin Kevin Hughes has coined the term, the seniors represent the golden DNA, and you absolutely want to tap into that golden DNA because of the fact of how DNA works. I can't stress how much that will really help your research. So I'll go ahead and turn it back over, because if not, I can keep talking for hours about the seniors and how their DNA has really helped break down some brick walls and clear up some potential rumors that we've had out there.
And I can expand on this. When he actually contacted me, that gal in Florida, the interesting thing is, you know, we immediately connected. It was supposed to be a very quick in and out type of meeting. When I was very impressed that this young guy right out of college, had driven down to meet me. He'd heard that I'd been carrying around this 5-inch binder that was jam-packed with all sorts of notes and documents that I had about family. And we ended up spending the entire weekend together. He stayed overnight at my house. We talked to the wee hours of the morning. And I was fascinated because I looked at all of these people that I'd been documenting as my paper relatives. And here, you know, he actually knew them. He grew up around them. And, you know, he was helping me to connect families that my father had been talking about. You know, they became concrete. And next thing you know, it started the collaboration and an association that's lasted now decades. You know, we've been working together, pretty much joined at the hip, and you know, with the goal basically of revealing the tremendous history of coastal Georgia and tying its descendants to the general arc of history, because for the most part, we've been marginalized and written out of it.
I wonder if Adolphus, you could talk about why it's so important to test the elders, the DNA test.
Yeah, because I think if you guys have kind of sat through any type of DNA presentation or made an attempt to try and learn the basics, one of the things that individuals will tell you is that for the most part, when we're doing the DNA testing, unless you're doing something specific on the paternal line or maternal line, which is a little bit more involved testing that's primarily conducted by family tree DNA. For the most part, we're always taking autosomal testing, and that's when they're literally looking at your 22 chromosomes and making an attempt to map those out. And then once you get into a specific database, it gives you an idea of who your DNA matches are. And with autosomal testing, it generally will take you back from yourself. It goes back about 250 years. And so, I was born in the 70s. So if I could get someone in the 30s who was born in the 1930s to test, I'm going back 250 years from the point that they were born. And so it's so critical to go ahead and try and get those seniors to test because of the fact that that's giving you a snapshot 250 years in the past. And I'll take a quick aside to kind of share something with you guys. I think on one of the other previous presentations that we had like a trivia question in McIntosh County. Can you name someone who's alive today who's all four of their great grandparents were actually enslaved? I think we gave the answer back, but that individual is cousin Mike Wilson. And because of the fact that, if you kind of think about it, cousin Mike Wilson is alive today, but all four of his grandparents were enslaved, born well before 1865. But the critical thing is, and thankfully, we were actually able to get cousin Mike Wilson to test. So if you can kind of think about it in that 250-year time frame, and pretty much how it works out is that in his family, he's like the younger son of second marriages. And so that's how you get back to the fact that his grandparents were enslaved. But because of the fact that he's actually DNA tested for us, that has given us such a wide view going back, into the past. And so if you kind of think about it, even though it says 250 years, but because of the fact that, he's the younger son, and going back 250 years for him, we're literally able to make connections to people that are born, well before 1800. So that's the beautiful thing of making sure that you get any senior that's willing to test. And I'll use a nice example is that I've had the opportunity to have my mother to test. So I've tested, my sister tested, and I have tested. But the interesting thing is with the random inheritance pattern of DNA, everything that I either got from my mother or my father. So if I had not tested, it would have been critical for me to get my mother to test. So if you yourself don't want to test, but if you can get someone in your direct ancestral line to test that's above you, you want to try and get them to test first because they're just going to have 100% of what you're going to get, and you're only going to get 50% of what they have to start out with. So you definitely want to go ahead and get the people that are further up on the DNA, on the family tree to test for you. And the example I would use is that there are people that match my mother, sister, but don't match me. So it's just a situation where, as the DNA got randomly passed down, my sister got it, I didn't. So for that match in that family line, it's just going to sit with my mother and my sister. So if you have not tested yourself, if you didn't have the opportunity to get your parents to test, you want to try and get as many of your siblings to test as possible to give you a nice solid representation of what you receive from your parents. And that also extends out to any older first cousins who might be willing to test. You would be surprised in terms of how those seniors help you figure out which side of the family that DNA is coming through on. So, and again, for African-American family, the DNA testing, I think, is absolutely critical. If you've done your research, you clearly understand that our families are complicated, in and of themselves. And because of the fact that what happens in our culture, it's not uncommon, say, if a child has a parent, or if a person happens to die young and they leave children behind, sometimes the grandparents will take a child, sometimes an older sister or sibling may take a child. And naturally, and sometimes this does happen, is that the parent who died young, sometimes they fade away from memory, and you're growing up in your grandparents' house, but you're growing up, that's mom and that's dad, and that's all you know. And so at that point in time, you're potentially missing a generation. But once you actually start to go through the process of taking the DNA test, it becomes clear that, okay, there's something else here in that these aren't my parents, they're my grandparents, based on how you may or may not be matching and sharing with other people who've tested in your family. So I highly, and I cannot stress how important it is to get those older people to test. And I'll share a quick story. For our family and some of the research that Terry and I've done, like in McIntosh County, there are two pockets of family. Well, there's the Moran family, and there's some that are in the north end of the county and some that are in the Ridge, Carnegie area. And people would always say, well, I don't think they're connected, but we've had some certain pockets of the family say not connected. Someone else will say, yep, it's all one big family. But in the advent of DNA, we've been able to prove that because of the fact that we've had some of my grandfather's siblings to test and some of Terry's, grandmother's siblings to test, based on their DNA matches, we're able to see that that pocket of Morans that were not related are actually related, and absent DNA, it would have been very difficult for us to put that together because of the fact that the records go back so far, well before the 1870s. So Tara, if you wanted to chime in on that one, I'm kicking the ball over to you.
No, you have really covered that extensively, but there's so much more to expound on. I can say in the case of my mother's family, it was always shrouded in a ton of mystery, and they really didn't talk about the past very much. And I bought a test for her, and she didn't immediately take to the idea. And somebody just put in the chat, I believe, they were asking, how do you actually get them to take a test for you? It is a process. In my mother's case, it was a Sunday afternoon on a Mother's Day, and I had plied her with a couple of mimosas, and we were feeling the moment. And she said, what's that test that you got? And I grabbed it, and we tested her that day. I was worried that the alcohol might impact the results, but she came through fine. And to be honest with you, it just blew open her family. She had connections to South Carolina that she had no idea about, which is essentially where a lot of the mystery was stuck. She had family of all places in Darien, in McIntosh County. She was totally oblivious about. And that made me fall over, because I'm seeing the names of people that I had always associated with my father's family. And then I actually tried to test my granduncle. He lived to be 102 years old, almost 3. And, he was kind of reserved and kind of cynical about the process, totally old school. He did allow me to test him, but I kept getting a failed result, an inconclusive result on Ancestry. And the 5th time I went to the well, he was like done with it. So interestingly enough, Adolphus happened to come in behind me one day, visit with him, and he caught him in the mood. He swabbed him. And today we have all of those results banked on the MyHeritage and GEDmatch websites. So it is very important. I can't emphasize it enough. Quite frankly, I would, knowing what I know now, I would try to test my parents before I tested myself, because they contain 50% of your DNA. They're right there. So if you have that opportunity, test a senior family member first and foremost, because as Adolphus has pointed out, you can get up to 2 generations that may have washed out of your own DNA just off of their results.
And I'll quickly, add to that. One of the things that, I guess came to the fore, in this, and again, I'll kind of finish up on Terry's story, is that I went to cousin Arthur DeVerger again. Terry alluded to the failed test, but, I'm pretty persistent, but I think the real reason why he agreed to test for me is that he has a little dog in the yard, and the dog almost tore my leg off. So I'm convinced he felt sorry for me. He's like, okay, kid, I'll go ahead and give it one more try, because of the fact that you might sue me because the dog almost took your leg off.
That was a mean little dog, Bo.
Well, and as Terry said, that was a great question from Shanna in the chat about how do you convince reluctant older people to, or anybody, to test. And she was talking about the lines that she tried and none of them worked. And I wonder if you guys have particular lines of argument that have worked for you.
Well, for me, what's really worked is that, I have a body of seniors that have already tested. So I'm not above name dropping, especially if because during my interview process, I'll typically ask for who were some of your close circle of friends, growing up, and just to try to, get a flavor of what their life is. And so if I kind of get an idea of who's in their circle, and especially if that person is still alive, and I know that they are pretty close, I'll start to name drop, say, I'm interviewing Undertaker Lois Lewis. He said that you guys are pretty close growing up. Well, guess what? He did a DNA test for me, and it has really helped. Your good friend Lewis did it. Do you mind? And that's one of the things that I've really been found of very effective, because what's crazy is that sometimes I'll get people in like little competition. It's like, well, I got 4 of this family branch to test. I'm not seeing nothing, 0 for your side of the family. We need to at least get one person to register in on this. And that, little friendly competition has been very helpful. Or the other piece of it is that if I can't get them to test, I'll see if I can maybe get one of their children to test. And then once the children kind of test, show the parents the results. And then to say, well, if you really got your parent to test, that'll really help you figure out the paternal maternal side of it. So it's just a matter of, working with families. And if you can at least get one to bite on it, then that I think makes it a little bit easier to see how these things start to come together. And especially because of the fact that you're dealing with a senior, they know their families 99% of the time. And so once they start to see these matches in and of themselves, I've been in presenting the match list to some seniors who were hesitant. And then I'm starting to, make my conjectures. I think I'm related to this person, and they'll quickly straighten me out. No, that's not how it works. That's, great aunt Mary's grandson. That's how that works. So once we start to go on that conversation path, it's like, well, if you took a DNA test, you're 3 generations removed from me, and your information would really help. And because of the fact that you're already looking at mine, you're so familiar with how this works, could you please consider, testing for us? Because that'll just help everyone in the family. And especially for your grandchild that tested, it would really open things up. So it's just a matter of, as you develop a relationship with people, just to see potentially, what works. But I am definitely not above, doing that name dropping and trying to stir up a little friendly competition, if that's what it takes to get someone to test.
What do you say to people who are really worried about bad implications of testing, government use of the DNA, company use of the DNA? Obviously, you guys have overcome those concerns because you're so into DNA.
Well, I'll go real quick in there because I know Terry has some thoughts on this. But, for me, you may not know it, but if you go to your doctor's office, someone draws your blood, your information is already out there. They may not do a full disclosure as to how it's being used, but your information is already out there, whether you know it or not. And at this point, I tell people to make an attempt to try and get ahead of the story, because it doesn't necessarily take you to test. If you're someone in your family, a brother or a sister has tested, your information in some way, shape, or form is almost already out there. And for an African-American researcher who's making an attempt to reconnect families, it's almost as if you're going to have to, weigh what's the probability of my information being out there. Is that, that any angst that I have surrounding that, is that more important than me maybe connecting with family members that may have been sold away during slavery? And for me, I obviously have opted to make sure that I try and connect with people that have been sold away during slavery. But for the most part, all the companies have and if you go to the privacy concerns, they'll have nice little write-ups as to how they use your information and what you do. Because one of the things that you guys may have heard years ago with the Golden Gate killer that was discovered through DNA on GEDmatch, but now GEDmatch has basically changed, how they do it. So you actually have the option of opting in or opting out of having your DNA available to police when they do their type of research in terms of trying to connect with people. And if you ever upload to MyHeritage, they literally have a box that verifies and makes sure that for kits that are going on their platform, if it's not being used for law enforcement purposes. And for the most part, I think the only DNA company that openly works with law enforcement is Family Tree DNA. everyone else, for the most part, if the law enforcement want to get to your information, for the most part, they have to have a subpoena or some type of compelling need to get there. And again, typically at this point, the DNA companies are hesitant of just allowing, say, law enforcement to get in. But the thing you have to know that as you're going through and checking in, there's certain instances where they have genetic research. You can opt in or opt out. And typically, depending if, when I'm doing it for my test, I will opt in. But for someone who's testing to be a part of the Low Country DNA Project, since we have not had that conversation, I automatically opt them out of any type of genetic research unless they tell me they want to participate. But we typically, don't have that level of conversations to start out with. And because of the fact that we have not had that conversation, I always, try and opt out and make their information as private, as restrictive as possible. So it's only open to people that are actual DNA matches to them. So Terry, I'll pass the ball to you.
I'm always telling people, it's like the toothpaste is already out the tube. You can't get it back in. The government, as you pointed out, has been collecting data on us and businesses for years now. And so if a relative, say even 3 or 4 generations back, just even having that type of information, they can and they will find you. So I tend to advise people at this point that taking the test far outweighs what it does for us as a people in terms of recovering our history, than the issues of privacy in this digital age. And in terms of privacy, it's only going to get even more intense. We're on the verge now, or the brink of opening up AI. And so that's going to have more consequences. And as I say this, I think it's very important that we take control of our data by, as you said, opting in, and at least you'd have a legal leg to stand on, basically, as to how it's used, or should it become potentially abused. So take control, go ahead and test, because again, you're not doing anybody a favor by holding back. It's like the train is left at station and there's no turning back. So that's essentially my thoughts on it in terms of the privacy issues.
And along the same lines, people who are afraid old family secrets are going to come out. And that also has to do with convincing people to test. And I think particularly men who might be afraid children might pop out.
Yes. And again, there really is no way to control that aspect. A seasoned researcher or genealogist will, that matches you, will have that ability to share that. And I'd like to think, like with any type of gossip, it is best, at least I would advise the approach is to own it, so that, again, take control of it, and then someone can't potentially use it, or weaponize it against you. So, that potential is always there. I know that it would be hard, because I've even thought about it myself. It would be hard if you should find, say, an unknown relative very, closely and intimately, related to you. But again, the old folks would say that truth will set you free. And I ascribed to that motto, basically. And I do think it's important, basically, that, you own it and you work through it. Ask the questions if the people involved are available. But I also think it is not your duty or responsibility to out people that basically aren't ready, to be publicized. So again, even with the type of work I do, a lot of people ask why I don't maintain a family tree. Well, my tree, I do. I just keep it on my hard drive, but my tree is actually comprised of about almost 80,000 people at this point. And I recognize that I made the decision to test, but not necessarily, people close to me. So I'm very happy to talk about those that have tested, and I'm happy to even talk about more intimate family members, but it's always with the agreement that they're not to be posted publicly without their expressed written permission.
And Stacey, the only thing that I would quickly add to that is that you absolutely want to be sensitive, because again, for those of you who are on the call, chances are you've been doing research for a while and you know your trees like the back of your hand. And you can definitely look at some of your matches and you could probably figure out, you know, a non-parental event. Now, when I see something like that, I absolutely do not, you make an attempt, as Terry noted, to rock the boat or make an attempt to out anybody. And if someone reaches out to me, you know, we will have a conversation, you know, on the sidebar. But for me, it's just something that, you know, if my grandfather raised a child, it doesn't matter what the DNA says. For our family, that's always going to be uncle or aunt so-and-so, and it does not matter. And I try and allow the DNA to, at best, expand your family as opposed to contracting it. And especially, you know, in our families, you know, if Big Mama says so-and-so is so-and-so, it does not matter. You know, for our family, you know, you're one of us and you can't get rid of us if you try to get away in a getaway car. So we're going to be on your tail, bringing you, dragging you back, kicking and screaming to the family reunion. We grew up together. We went to Sunday dinner at grandma's, and there's no way around that one. So I always, you know, want people, you know, you have to kind of examine why you're getting into this, is to make connections and not break connections.
And I think if you're asking someone to test, the issue of informed consent is very important, that they understand up front that there, you know, these kind of issues could pop up and here's how we deal with them. Shelley commented that the way she got her father to test was the health angle, because the DNA, you know, you could test with Ancestry or 23andMe and get some health information. And ER had a great comment that, you know, these things happen and nobody should be held hostage from the truth of their family, which I think is great.
That is perfect.
I was going to ask, obviously you and I, we all work together. So for people like myself who are descendants of enslavers, when they find information in their family research that gives the name of enslaved people or other information, what would you recommend that they do, and how should they reach out if they find, for example, DNA cousins, or if they're African-American DNA cousins, or if they are able to somehow identify the people, descendants of the people that they have found in their records? How would you recommend they reach out?
Well, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Yes, sorry, it was a long one. So for people like myself who are descendants of enslavers, and as we do our family research, so we might find the names of people held in slavery by our families. We might even be able to identify descendants if we have enough information. How would you recommend that we reach out or get that information out there to help someone?
Well, that's one of these very profound and layered questions. I know for many, they would find it awkward, especially, you know, in looking at the differences in say race. And but here's my perspective. It is very important that we collaborate as we do this type of work, and you know, and it is sensitive because we know as a whole the nation does have some problems. But first of all, DNA has no color. It's purely science. It will not divide us up in, you know, black and white. And say for white Europeans, when you do find, say, African Americans in your tree, I advise them that it's kind of like a Rosetta Stone, because we help one to uncover family lines that may have fallen from the family record. This often happens with people that live across the pond in England. They're like, you know, we've never set foot in the Americas, you know, how can this be? So I like to think of it as a potential to open some doors and recover, you know, lost family lines. And in the end, your goal is to have an accurate family tree. Now, for Black folks, basically it represents you know, that the family line has been compromised, and we are aware of that historically, innately. You know, we grow up knowing this, and the DNA now has shown that basically 25% of us, well, 25% of our DNA is comprised of European ancestry. And we all know how it got there. You look at, say, the lines of African-American men, 30% go back to a European patriarch. It's top of the line. So again, it's definitely something that we can't ignore. And I would just say for each, to take advantage of this opportunity to transcend it. But the most important part, I would also say, is that we as a people cannot acknowledge, we cannot address what we won't acknowledge. And it is at the root of all of our social problems, the way I see it today. It's this inability to deal with these hard truths, to talk about it in a productive way and move forward. There's a lot of shame and blame, tied up, to our shared history, the dysfunction that's now inherent in it. And I believe, again, that if we do not give voice and acknowledge and validate it, we will just continue in this perpetual cycle. And we'll be talking about this, say, 2 or 3 generations from now. So again, for white researchers, it can be a gift. For Black researchers, I think when somebody reaches out to you, you have to extend the grace to them, to allow them to be comfortable in talking and working through this with you. They're not to blame for their ancestors' deeds. And quite frankly, like all of us, I think we all take on this endeavor with the idea of ancestor worship. It's inherent in all cultures. It's a universal thing. We all want to revere our ancestors. And then you discover this ugly truth, and it's jarring. But again, I think it's an opportunity to heal, to, like I said, to acknowledge, validate, and move forward. And again, I just, the DNA has been wonderful in revealing these lost connections. And I think we're being called, to pay attention and take heed and heal.
One thing that I would add to what Terry just shared is that, unfortunately, everyone's not going to be a Stacey Cole and embark on a They Had Names project. But if you see this information in your family records and your family papers, and if you're not comfortable with it, I would want you to consider maybe donating them to a local historical society or your local library if they will accept it. For an African-American family, we don't have access to these records because of the fact that they're your private family documents. But if you see us documented in your family documents, records, and for us being able to access that information is going to be absolutely invaluable. So if you don't necessarily want to deal with it directly, if you could consider donating the papers to an historical society, that would be fantastic, because at some point, some researcher from one of those families might be able to access it, via those entities.
It's important to reach out. I've had a couple of personal stories along the way. We ran into a gentleman years ago who basically cleaned an office building in Chatham County, found a document that basically outlines 2 of the owners of of a second great grandmother fighting over her in a lawsuit. Now, I've seen an abstract, and I had noted that, so I knew it existed, but I've never been able to find the actual court case. So this gentleman has the court case, and what it would mean to my family to know what happened. And I think it would actually explain a little bit more about her ties and the interests of the family in her ownership. I can't put into words what it would mean to have that document. And even though we crossed paths many years ago, I've still been unable to obtain that. So that's a very hard thing, knowing that the documents are out there, they do exist. And so again, if you do run into say an African line where you didn't expect it. I just think there's so many, tremendous opportunities, to help move this information, forward.
And as a white researcher, I've reached out a number of times to people on Ancestry, either to help provide information or to say we have a DNA link. And I have never received an unwelcoming response. Sometimes people don't answer, but that happens all the time anyways. But it's only led to good things for me. Imorja asked, how can someone find their family on an enslaved records if they were not listed by name, but rather by number and description?
Okay, so let me rephrase this. You have a document, you just have numbers. So I'm assuming say like a census record that basically, a slave schedule has no names. The only thing you can do is you must build a case, basically. The first priority would be to first establish ownership. And it's interesting. That comes through asking a lot of questions. A lot of African-American researchers kind of assume that their surname is the name of that last owner, which is not necessarily the case. And I think you and I've discussed this many times, Stacy, that is really the theme of your website. They had names, but it's very rare that an enslaved ancestor took that last owner's name. Sometimes when it does happen, it's because maybe they may have mustered into the military during that time, and it was easier for the registrar to just record that slave's owner. But in many cases, and this has happened in my family, as soon as they're out of the military, they will change that name. So we have an incidence, at least in doing African-American genealogies, I always say the names are unstable, and it's best to let any preconceived notions about that surname go. In the case of, say, my ward name, it's out of Liberty County. I'm not related to the European branch of wards. And as far as I can tell at this point, I don't believe that they own my family. But the family glory is that immediately after the war, during Reconstruction, they allowed my ancestors to squat on their property. And they were grateful, and they liked the former owner of the land, and they chose to carry his name forward. But there isn't a genetic connection to that set of wards in Liberty County. So again, I would just advise people, one, to let that go and strictly follow the DNA. And you start by basically looking to establish clusters. Ancestry has been very helpful, and I got to give them props because it's been a long time coming, and this is something I've been doing manually. But just being able to separate your family lines out by maternal and paternal sides is a huge help. And then I would then proceed to identify clusters within each side. Now, again, for coastal Georgians, we do run into the problem of endogamy, which basically is cousins marrying cousins. So it gets a little twisty, more than a little, it's just twisted. But that said, it is still possible to break them out into genetic clusters. And what I do initially, and again, this is without having a whole lot of training, I tend to feel like my background in genetic genealogy grew organically. I just started clustering people and trying to figure out what they had in common. So when you hit that in common with button on your matches, you're looking at a cluster of people that share an ancestor. So again, that would be the direction I would take Ancestry in. And I do want to point out now that with SideView, with them dividing up our families for us automatically, it is also helpful now. You're working another generation up to start clustering that, because you're looking at your grandparents' DNA here. So start clustering that. You're further up the chain. Now, in terms of using the other websites, which we'll get into a little further, they have some tremendous tools, and I always advise people to get into a chromosome browser. yeah, you can do genetic genealogy and look at your DNA results without a chromosome browser, but basically all you can confirm is that we are related. But once you get them into a chromosome browser, then you could start doing more detailed, and again, this is more of an intermediate and advanced techniques, but you'll be able to get into segment analysis. You'll be able to see exactly where you match on specific chromosomes. And the thought is that if your segments line, you pretty much share a common ancestor. So again, I advise anybody, you might test it Ancestry, upload those results into MyHeritage, which you may do for free. You can also pay a nominal fee. It's under like $30 basically to have access to all the genetic tools, and they run some beautiful reports and helpful. But pretty much 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, the same thing. You can upload your results into those platforms. Oh, except for 23andMe, I'm sorry. You have to test directly with them, but you do have access to that chromosome browser. And that, I think, is so necessary for those of us doing or working through the really tangled roots of African-American ancestry along the Georgia coast.
Catherine has her hand up for a question. Catherine, you can unmute.
Hi, I'm in Georgia, but we have relatives mainly from Bermuda, Barbados, and we're finding even more now in the United States. But what has been curious is that we're finding, like one of the presenters, that people we thought were only on one parent's side or the other parent's side are actually on both sides. But Ancestry is not showing them as being on both sides. So I was wondering, does Ancestry properly identify the presenter's relatives as being on both sides of his family?
Well, from what I understand, and I knew immediately when I looked at my side view that it's off. But again, my parents, Carrie, shared ancestry. So it is off. But a lot of people are saying, and I belong to several Facebook groups, a lot of people are saying that they're pretty accurate. Again, you know, each platform has its process as to how they determine you know, how you match with another tester. They have their own algorithms in place. So again, what I would tell you, it's important to, you know, cluster your groups out. You might have a cluster that's going to be shared down the road. Usually that's even further back, because my general theory to, you know, for African-American research is people tend to buy in or think again of that triangular pedigree chart that we'd have, where we start with ourselves and go up and it gets increasingly bigger. But because we do have these crisscrossing relationships, and that means an ancestor, a grandparent might show up more than once within our tree because they're shared, we're going back to an increasingly smaller pool of ancestors. And I theorized this even before I had taken DNA tests, and I actually shared with Adolphus that I think, with as extensive as the research has been in the documentation, that we're actually looking at families, you know, ancestors that we think we still need to be on the lookout for. They're there. And the DNA is showing that. They're showing that, you know, further back, there is this other connection, and the descendants have been intermarrying and, you know, have basically lost that. But again, I do think it's important that you systematically work through your list. If you can get a downloaded copy, which, you know, like I said, MyHeritage does allow you to do that, it's very helpful because you will have your segments to analyze, and you have start and end points as to, you know, again, where that association or matchup is. So it's a process. This is collaborative work. So I know people aren't always open to following up with you when you reach out. I'm famous for it. I reach out to a lot of people, and, you know, it's uncanny because I can tell them where we match, but they don't write back. But again, all of us test for our own different reasons. Like you said, some people for health, some people are just interested in the ethnicity pieces. But there is, I'm just grateful that they have tested and that they have posted. And if you have an option, to share, because again, this is a big thing on 23andMe. When you opt in, they ask you to share. Do share. A lot of people are automatically saying no, and it does make it difficult to figure out, where the connections are. But again, I say difficult, not impossible. Because the more obsessed among us, approach these results like a bloodhound, and we will, eventually find you. And that's been my experience so far. But it is possible. It does take time. Just again, put together the clusters. I can tell you personally, like I said, my mother's family network was blown wide open because I relied on these clusters that all seem to not be associated with each other. And when it all clicked, I went back to the paper records. I was able to line the oral history, the paper, and now the DNA came together, and I am now several generations back finding, which surprisingly, Mormon lines, and like I said, the Patriot lines, they all come together. But it does take time. It helps to collaborate. A good collaboration like the one that I've established with Adolphus keeps you going, keeps you focused. And I personally feel that a lot of us just really need to talk more, to get this work done. I truly believe it's possible. And it's very counter to the way we were raised when we were pretty much told that you can't find African-American ancestry because there are no records.
Thank you, Terry. It looks like Deborah has a question. Hi, Deborah.
Hello. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask my question. I need to go back and get some clarification in my mind. I have only two elderly people in my family. One is direct, and the other one is a second cousin. We share the same great grandmother. Is it worthwhile having him test DNA test? I know the direct one, yes, but what about that second cousin?
You want to take that, Adolphus?
Yeah, I would definitely say if you have those two individuals, I would definitely have them both test. And just because of the fact of the random inheritance pattern of DNA, there might be a parent for that great grandparent that's coming through to your second cousin that no one in your current line got any of that DNA. And you may have actually mapped it out in your tree in your research, but it's just great to have that DNA to kind of help you figure out additional lines that may have gotten lost over the years. And again, through to people moving away or, female marrying into a new family and the memory of that surname gets lost. But I would definitely have that second cousin to test. If they are willing to test, definitely go ahead and get them to test. Because the wonderful thing is, once they test, you have the information and you've been researching for years. And, sometimes it comes and goes in terms of your optimism or your get up and go to jump into the research. But if you get the test, you can always come back to it next week, next month, and 4 years. But it's once you have that test, you can always come back to it. So if you don't have it, you can't do that. So I really want people to go ahead and get your seniors to test if they are able.
You're actually seeking out coverage. And the interesting thing, there's a randomness to DNA. We all don't get the same thing. And you'll see that even with twins and siblings. They don't necessarily carry the same genetic markers, and they may differ. Or you might carry different amounts. So you're aiming for coverage because whereas say, for example, that I didn't get any of the, and I often joke about this. I do have heritage connected to Sapelo Island. I'm a descendant of Bilali Muhammad. And as it turns out, it's been, I didn't get a whole lot of my Hillary line, which was one of his oldest daughters. I didn't get a lot of that, me personally, but a lot of my cousins did. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to test my siblings, but I'm very curious. But a lot of my cousins did. It doesn't take away from me. It's there just in small amounts, for me. So apparently, the random nature of DNA, I didn't get it. And if I didn't bother to test other extended family members, it's something that's history that would be lost to me.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you all want to talk about the difference between the various testing platforms and how you choose which one to use?
Well, for me, once you start out doing the DNA, anyone who's listened to a presentation, they will tell you that you want to be in as many different databases as possible because of the fact that you don't know where your matches are testing. They may be in Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, Living DNA. So you don't know where they're going to be testing. So you want to be in as many databases as possible because you never know where you're going to actually come up with a match. And keep in mind that for Ancestry and 23andMe, they are saliva tests. And so that means that you have to get the tube and get to that little black line. So depending if you're able to produce a lot of saliva, that could, be a concern. But Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage, those are both cheek swab tests. And at this point, as I go through, depending on, the person's health and how reticent they may or may not be to do a test, I opt to have my seniors test with the cheek swab test if there happens to be an issue. Because think about it, it's a cheek swab, 20 seconds, one cheek swab, 20 seconds. So under a minute, you're done. And they probably don't even remember that they ever tested for you because of the fact that it was so quick. And so that's one of the things that I will share with you is that I've had a lot more success. At this point, I have not had a cheek swab test to come back with an inconclusive result. And when Terry gave the example earlier of her great uncle that had 5+ failed or inconclusive tests with Ancestry, we started this when he was 99. So time was not on our side. And so by the time he's 101, and I happen to show up with that cheek swab test after having my leg ravaged by his dog Bo, he tested for me. But thank God that cheek swab test gave us a result that we can now work with. And so that's what I would tell people, depending on, what the issue may or may not be with my seniors, just to make sure that you don't come back with an inconclusive result. I like to go with the cheek swab test just because of the fact that it is so quick.
And just kind of to sum it up, basically, each of the testing companies have strengths and weaknesses. There's no one-stop solution that is everything to everybody. So it's important to figure out why or what information that you want. But basically, the differences are the size of the databases, the price, and the type of information that you're seeking. So again, size-wise, Ancestry is the big gorilla in the room. I mean, they have squashed their competition in terms of the size of that database and, the numerous trees that they offer. So consequently, a lot of African Americans end up testing there. But it is the company that does not have a whole lot of tools in terms of doing the type of precise research that we're seeking to do to recover a lot of the lost family history, basically. So you do, like I said, I do feel that you need to be on a chromosome browser to look more closely at these connections. Then 23andMe is phenomenal. They got beautiful tests. You get information on your haplogroups, which basically will tell you like your most ancient origins, helps with migratory patterns. And again, when you start doing or looking at, say, Y-DNA, which is the DNA that's passed from father to son in an unbroken chain, it's nice to have that type of information. But I would say if you're more interested in finding out, say, genetic markers that pertain to health, then you go with 23andMe. But again, they do have beautiful reports, and I do love their timeline, which seems to be accurate. It pinpoints exactly when certain DNA may have entered your family line, and mine seems to be accurate. I can look through the period of the Revolutionary War, through the period of the antebellum and after, and so it makes sense. My heritage, it's a personal favorite. You know, I've actually done presentations, and I was, you know, continue to be grateful for the support that they've given us in terms of testing our elders. I would really love to see it become a hub for Low Country Georgia DNA, and most of the elderly family members, or the most senior ones that we tested, Adolphus has them uploaded in MyHeritage. But the nice thing about it is not only do you get this chromosome browser, they also have many tools to use that will allow you to see your DNA in different ways. You're allowed to do what we call a triangulation, when three people match on the very same segment in the very same spot, which again pretty much tells you that they do share an ancestor. If any of you were privy to looking at my presentation for Mary Dolly Moran, she's got a ton of endogamy in hers, but through triangulation, I was actually able to split her her maternal line down into the smaller segments that nobody could tell me about. So again, you know, these types of tools are wonderful, and they vary. Family Tree Maker also has a chromosome browser. So it's a good option, but again, a much smaller database, and it's not as likely that you'd find as many matches. You'll find some good matches, but not as many as, say, you would find on Ancestry. And I know some people have asked about some of these others that are coming up. I would encourage you to stay with the big four, which would be Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA, because again, you want some size, you want a number of matches. And again, even, you know, like I said, with Family Tree DNA, when you're ready to take that next leap, you might opt to take the more expensive test of Y-DNA, which would, you know, track your paternal side, and it would be worth it. But again, if you take the test and the people aren't there, then you might have to wait years, you know, for that connection to happen. So again, it's really a matter of what you want to accomplish. If you simply want to find you know, relatives that you might know anything about, close relatives, or just affirm that you're related, then again, you know, Ancestry is a good choice. But if you're going to do the very detailed work that you need down the road, I would opt for a platform that has a chromosome browser. And then again, I should add, with Ancestry, the nice thing about these other tests, you can always download those results and upload it to these other platforms.
Sharon has a question.
Hi, I have a cousin who did his ancestry with blackancestry.com. I think that's what it's called. And anyway, he wrote me back and told me that he is a member of the Igbo tribe from Africa. I was not sure how close this particular ancestry program really mirrored what we were seeing in the States, if this makes any sense to you. I just was unsure that it was giving the same kinds of results that the other big four were giving. Furthermore, those tests were far more expensive. So can you speak to that, please?
Well, Terry, I'll jump in real quick. In terms of, and again, it might be African DNA testing that they did. I think with Professor, is it Kerry Kettles? I think he's one of the founders of that company. In that it does not look for actual matches. It will literally test you on your paternal line and your maternal line going all the way back in terms of testing, you know, African Americans basically for that level. Like they have the largest reference panel of African American individuals. But again, it makes an attempt to try and isolate you to one paternal or maternal tribe in Africa. And that's the only thing that it does for you. They do not, maintain your DNA to help you, make any matches like the other, testing companies do in terms of looking at your autosomal DNA just to see who you may or may not, match with. But again, like Terry noted earlier, it all depends on what you're hoping to get out of the test. So if you want to try and get an idea of a particular tribe in Africa that you may match with, if you can't get there by actual doing the genealogical research, well, African Ancestry might be an option for you if you want to be able to get that general. But again, they're constantly, updating the reference panels. And so similar to how companies like Ancestry, 23andMe will update their ethnicity results, well, at some point, African Ancestry will probably be doing the same thing because they're always, improving their reference panels and giving you a little bit more finite or tighter information as to specifically which tribe you may not match with. But again, with you, my focus has always been people that I match with here. And so I haven't opted to incur that expense of doing the African, ancestry piece. But for me, some of our folks like cousin Leon Relaford's, on the call, like they've done enough research. I'm relatively comfortable with the Amelia song and what they've done. I know that there's a direct tie to Sierra Leone. And so I'm comfortable that that's sufficient for me in conjunction with what I'm looking at with Ancestry and 23andMe. That's enough for me at this point. But some people want to dig a little bit deeper. But again, that's an additional $400 that I would rather use to get more of my seniors to test.
Yeah, and I haven't tested with African DNA yet. It's a great company, and I know that people that have tested are really pleased with the results that they've gotten, and they've gotten a lot of information in terms of the African American populations that have been sampled, and that's key. That have been sampled. So again, I look at it as something that I would probably supplement my research with somewhere down the line, but my immediate need right now is to identify these genetic clusters here in the States. So that's where I would encourage others, to test first and then supplement it with that type of information. And as Adolphus pointed out, the thing, essentially you're looking at a platform that's more focused on the ethnicity factors, because again, Africa is composed of numerous ethnicities. It gets lumped in and say Africans, but these are all, several cultures on one continent. And now in saying that too, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that just general history makes that idea of just focusing on, say, ethnicity solely very challenging, because the people that are, of Africa are pretty much nomadic. And the people of one era aren't the same people of today. And these are the people that are being sampled. For example, like I mentioned Bilal Muhammad, he goes down on record that he is a Fulani of Berber extraction. Well, the Berbers are pretty much an Arabic ethnicity. But the Fulani of today have overrun and conquered most of Africa, and they were responsible for pretty much spreading Islam across the north. And the Fulani of today aren't necessarily the Fulani of his time period. So, that's something to consider and take into account. Those areas have changed, and even today, Africa is still at war in many respects. So again, the populations and the people are changing also.
Alicia said that she was thinking about getting her mother to do an mtDNA test, and she had heard that there wouldn't be enough Black matches to make it worthwhile, and Y-DNA as well. Might as well cover.
Well, I think in that respect, in terms of the size of the database, whoever gave her that information is accurate in that it is the small of the big four. It's the smallest database, and you don't have a whole lot of African American who have tested there. But literally, in order to get your information into Family Tree DNA on the autosomal piece, it is a free upload. But when you start to do the Y-DNA test all the way up to the big 700 test, that is an additional test. But, I've had one relative we tested with the big 700 test, and then I myself, did the mtDNA test. And, I didn't expect much, but I'm just waiting over the course of time, because at this point, I do not have any matches. But, again, when you're doing the research, you're doing your DNA, it is a marathon and not a sprint. So, it doesn't hurt to, especially if you can catch one of these sales that they constantly do, I would definitely, put that information out there, because for me, how it really will be helpful is that if you have a big Y or MT match, and they're also an autosomal match, that'll literally help you start to put the pieces of the puzzle together, because of the fact that with the Y, and then when they're doing the MT test, that goes back so much further. It'll be very difficult in terms of you doing your genealogical research to actually make that connection. So hopefully you can find someone who matches on the autosomal side and also is a match with an MT match or a big Y match.
Thank you all so much.
Janice has a question, and then Emma also wanted to say something about African ancestry.
Hi, everybody. This is Janice. I'm from New Jersey. I just wanted to piggyback on what Alicia, is that, did I say your name right? If I didn't, I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's Elisha.
Elisha. Okay. I apologize. So I just wanted to comment on the question that you had about the mtDNA. So I did the mtDNA on my father, on myself, and on two of my cousins. Now, I did my father's mtDNA probably, I don't know, maybe it was 2005. So before I even understood what mtDNA was, but I went ahead and did so with the thought that, sometime in the future, I may be able to use this information, hopefully understand it a little bit better. So I just went back and checked because I saw your question in the chat. I just went and checked, and so here we are in 2022. And my dad has 495 mtDNA matches in that L2A haplogroup. So, I mean, I would say that it's worth it to go ahead on and do it, especially if you can, catch a sale, because over time, as people test, those matches will start to build, more and more and more. Now, I did it on myself recently. So within the last, I don't know, maybe 6 to 8 months. And so right now I only have 12 mtDNA matches. So, but over time I would expect that to grow, if that helps you out any.
Thanks so much, Janice. And it is done. You have solidified that for me.
Okay.
I want to catch a sale.
All right.
Thank you.
And that's wonderful, because Janice is making and doing tremendous work. But she started off with an autosomal DNA test first, and then she expanded out and did the Y-DNA, I believe, as well as the MT DNA testing with Family Tree DNA. So I highlighted her in my last newsletter because, again, this is an example of somebody that's just doing some trailblazing work, to figure out these most extant DNA matches.
Stacy, how much time do we have left? There's one item that I know I wanted to mention, but I didn't want to lose track of the time.
We usually go to 3:30, so we have about 15 minutes.
Okay.
There was Emma wanted to say something, and I'm told that Denise Edwards has had her hand up as well.
Okay, well, I'll go once those questions, I'll remember to circle back. Okay, thanks.
Emma?
This is Emma. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
We hear you, Emma.
Hello? I can't hear anybody now.
We hear you, Emma.
Oh, you do? Okay, yes. I just want to make a comment about African ancestry. There's a lot of confusion around what they do. Cost is very, very expensive. African ancestor was first
Emma,
out of,
I'm sorry. I think there's something beeping at your end.
hello?
Can you try muting and just see if
Oh,
the
my
beep?
refrigerator is beeping. What am I supposed to do?
Okay.
Okay.
It's still beeping.
Okay, it's okay. It's okay. No.
Yeah, there it's done. It's done.
I just want to say something about African ancestors. There's a lot of confusion. African ancestors is also the first genealogy testing on the chute, but their purpose is not to connect you with your ancestors. You're not going to find that. Their purpose was to connect with a particular African ethnic group in Africa. Now, one thing they do, you don't have to worry about the modern migration. What Dr. Kittle said, he did, yes, Africa, you got people who are in Nigeria, they may be in Ghana, Botswana may be over in Senegal, but what he said he did in his dialogue, when he took these tests about 25 years ago, he asked that person, he checked for migration. If he's testing somebody in Nigeria, he's making sure that their ancestors were in Nigeria. So when you see that, and it comes back Ghana, that person is probably Ghana. Does that make sense? However, he tests very small markers. So sometimes that's not quite accurate. He doesn't test, there was small marker testing, so it may be accurate, it may not be accurate, but the principal reason that I think most of the students see that it is not going to connect you with someone who is possibly your blood cousin. It's just going to connect you with a possible tribe that your person was in. And it's very expensive. I take that into consideration, depending like Annapolis or Terry said, what are you looking for? If you just want to know about a tribe, take the test and you get beautiful charts. You get beautiful charts and you get enrolled in a little group and you get all kind of historical stuff, but it's not going to take you back to a DNA cousin at all.
No, thank you, Emma, for pointing that out. Again, like I said, I've always looked at it as something to supplement the research. I'm not, even with the big companies, I would advise people not to get so entrenched on what is reported in terms of ethnicity. This is a new emerging field, of testing for the most part. The sampling is growing and getting better. It'll become more precise, but for now, there are many factors that go into deciding what constitutes an ethnic group. So again, I just wouldn't get too tied to it. I know there are people that pretty much test to learn about it, but there again, it's dependent on too many factors, and in the end, ethnicity is a social construct. And say, for example, when you go to Latin American countries, which are display various levels of admixture depending on the country, who is considered Black and who is considered white will vary tremendously from our perceptions of Black and white. So again, look at it as a social construct. These estimates are bound, and they do, we're seeing this now, they change, but the sampling will get better, and at some point we'll have a much clearer idea of the different groups, that this clash of cultures basically that's in our DNA. I just noticed Michael and Tanya Hurd, cousins. Anyway, good to see you here. It is very true. There's a lot missing from Latin American countries. It all depends on the sampling and where they go. And I'll point out, even like with France, DNA testing isn't allowed; it's prohibited. So you have Iberian, Mediterranean markers in France. There's a good chance that it's not detected or even mentioned. A good example too, again, historically, the boundaries, the borders of different countries. I actually grew up very close to the French border with Belgium and Liechtenstein and all these little countries just within driving distance, say 30, 45 minutes. So again, it's hard to just zero in and say, that these estimates are precise. They're at best based on a swath of sampling that confirms them for now.
Thank you, Terry. Denise Edwards, did you have a question?
Okay, yes. I wanted to also comment on the African ancestry test. I took that too. And for the most part, it was because when I took initially the 23andMe test, they would just say that your African ancestry was sub-Saharan African. And I wanted to know specifically which tribes and everything I was from, which countries. And they told me Nigerian and Fulani. So I was happy to get that information. Now, in addition to that, I'm happy also to see my brother-in-law, James Michael, and my sister on here, because they are the ones that sent me information about this. And I'm happy that to have become acquainted with Stacy and Terry. And my question more or less is, Stacy, you have They Had a Name project, I think. I was wondering if there are any other projects like that in other counties. Specifically, our family is from Lincoln County, McDuffie County, Warren County, Columbia County. Are there other counties in Georgia that have something similar that we can go to? Because I agree with you that we who are descended from enslaved shouldn't have to go through people who are descended from the enslaver to get the information that we're seeking. Like, I'm trying to trace my family back as far as possible. Are there other counties that have that type of thing?
I don't know of others. GlenGen.com by Amy Hedrick has it's both, it has coastal Georgia information, but it's all ethnicities. So it's not specific the way mine is. I know there's someone who also did a book in Washington County. I haven't seen the book, but I just remember hearing about it. And the Augusta Genealogical Society, you mentioned Columbia County, which I think, if I remember right, is part of Augusta. They have a book that they sell. It's a little pricey, but of transcriptions that they have done. So I agree. That's one reason why I put the information out on a website. I'm always happy to get contacted, but I also, anybody who doesn't want to have the contact or just wants to absorb the information first, it's better to have it out there and to be able to search and pull together a bunch of different records. So I know one of the hopes for my project is that it will inspire other people or groups to do something similar.
What county is that person?
Washington County is the one that's a book, and I think, Emma, I think you might know him. I can't remember.
What county are they researching? You know, there's a book, Washington County was done, big book, and there's Edgefield County has some books out there, but I'm reading a book now on Upshur County, lots of stuff in there. But what county is that person researching? Who asked the question?
Lincoln and Columbia and McDuffie, I think you said.
I said Lincoln County, Columbia County, Warren County, McDuffie County, and even, yeah, well, those are where my ancestors were enslaved.
Don't know anybody doing those counties in particular, but I would encourage you to look at the Georgia website, Georgia Archives website, and look at the things that they have there, various counties. Or look at the Georgia Archives website and see what kind of things they have on Georgia that's available. And some of their stuff, a little bit of it is digitized.
Thank you.
And interesting, I was just on eBay not too long ago, and I noticed that a lot of counties have sellers that have kind of aggregated a lot of old books specific to particular counties. And they'll have anywhere from 8 to even 30 books digitized. And again, it caught my attention because there were some counties and there were some books that I saw among some of them that I was really interested in. And you won't walk up on these, say, either online or in a library. So I would give that a check as well. But again, you know, our history is intimately tied together. I think, again, that's what the DNA is emphasizing to us. And, you know, slavery, the institution basically forces us to examine the owners. And I know there are people that say they're reluctant to, make those connections, but you are in a sense just leaving a good part of your family history on the table if you take that type of attitude. If you follow the movement and the placement of the slave owner, you know who had access or where your folks will be. So I can't emphasize enough. And I've the last couple of months, I've been spending a lot of time working on, say, the largest slave owners of each area, basically to get a better idea. And I am just thoroughly bowled over when I see how wide and expansive that network is. And I found answers basically, again, when I run into people that have said they've never had any type of association to the South or that area, and they just can't connect, and they're having a hard time believing the DNA. But if you start to really dig into these planter lines, you will, find names. You will find the connections basically, and it is a big clue as to where you need to go next. And I'm going to expound on where to go next because again, I started my research in McIntosh County, from my father's side. I was reluctant to dive into Chatham because it's so vast and big, and my mother has pretty generic surnames in her family, and I just like Johnson, Smith, Jones, I just didn't think it would be possible. But again, if you look at the ownership, which I'm proud to say to this day, I actually know the owners of my mother's family lines. I couldn't have conceived that because she didn't carry that forward. I didn't have a grandmother that carried that forward, and I didn't get to know that second great grandmother who could have given that to me. But I started looking at these plantation families, looking at my DNA matches, which go back to them, and resolved and pretty much demolished, brick walls and different mysteries that were stifling. So it's I would advise you, to take the whole, keep the whole big picture in mind as you proceed and move forward.
Adolphus, I think you had something that you wanted to.
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to share a little bit of information about the genesis of the Low Country DNA Project and how we really kind of got into a higher gear. In that you guys are probably familiar, we're coming up to the end of February, beginning of March, and we're having the commemoration of the Weeping Time, which is the largest slave auction that took place in the United States. And Brian Sheffy, and with his project, and Martinez, on the call, they utilized the Beyond Kin method to make an attempt to try and match up some of those, to document some of those enslaved families. And because of the fact that Butler Island was a focus, and because I grew up in McIntosh County, one of the items that we wanted to do as a part of the Low Country DNA Project was to really test the seniors that were in McIntosh County. And one of the 3 focus groups that we have are Sapelo Island, Harris Neck, and Butler Island. And the thought process behind that being for the families that generally stayed in the area, as Terry mentioned, with endogamy and pedigree collapse, with cousins marrying cousins, there's a greater likelihood that someone who stayed in McIntosh County is going to retain some of the DNA from those enslaved ancestors. So if someone was sold away, if we could get a nice solid foundation of people still in McIntosh County to test, then based on probability, that'll give us a higher chance of matching someone who may have been sold away, just because of the fact that that DNA is still pretty heavy and thick, on that coastal Georgia, and for those people that are still there. And so that is the kind of like focus. And to that end, we partnered with MyHeritage, and they've committed to help us test 100 seniors. So if you know of anyone who has ties or ancestral ties to Harris Neck, Butler Island, or Sapelo, we definitely would want to work with them to go ahead and try and get them tested. And again, the focus would be looking at seniors. Thank you, Stacy.
That was great, Adolphus. If anybody else has any more questions, we can go a few more minutes. I just put in the chat that after I get the recording done and put online, I'll send an email to everyone who was registered with a link to the recording, a copy of the chat, and the handout, so you can feel free to pass it along to anyone you want.
I would like to emphasize too, although, you know, DNA testing has really opened up a lot of doors, and it is wonderful. I don't want you to neglect the actual documents that are available. And I'm going to bring this up specifically as it pertains to McIntosh County, you know, where, again, I started off. I was consistently told that it's impossible to do because all the records are gone, they're burnt up. And, you know, I challenge this, and I'm going to ask you to take a similar attitude, because again, if you know the history of the area, the counties, you know, carved out from Liberty, which was originally carved out from Chatham, they're all interconnected. Take a time, you know, to research surrounding counties, because in some cases the records or hints may be there. There are a ton of different ways of getting around those so-called burnt out county scenario. And I'm even kind of cynical about the issue of, say, the burnt out county, because everybody attributes it to the actual burning of Darien in 1863. But an interesting thing that I noted, we do have a free family of color known as the Garys, and their accounts are saved in the Southern Claims Commissions. And I took note that one of Eliza Gary's, which she was a woman who, again, free woman of color, who pretty much ended up serving as a spy for the Union forces. But her son noted that he saw Union soldiers removing loot from the families, you know, heirlooms and books and stuff. And we don't think of books as, say, valuable, but to have a library at that time, that was a valuable asset. So I personally tend to think that a lot of documents are in private hands now, because again, when I think about that story, and I also want to note this probability and scenario, the Confederates had planned to actually burn Darien before the 54th Colored Infantry got there, and they received their commands from Colonel James Montgomery, which they were led by Robert Gould Shaw. And anybody that studied the burning of Darien, he was essentially blamed for the act. And, you know, many people over the years have, you know, harbored a lot of resentment towards this act, because they looked at it as an unoccupied town that was, you know, burnt down and defenseless. It only had older white slave owners and a few slaves that weren't marched inward. So that said, that's an interesting thing, because if they were planning to actually burn Darien 2 weeks or a couple of weeks before, they probably took steps to pull out their most valuable records. So again, makes me kind of wonder if these are just kind of laying around in private hands at this point, because, you know, it is the fact they did plan to burn Darien before it was actually burnt. Then again, when you go back just 10 years after, during the Reconstruction period, we had another major burning, and that was during the height of Tunis Campbell, you know, pretty much running the country, the county. And with that said, you know, it's been proposed to me that a lot of those records, the courthouse was basically targeted and burnt, because you have a big transition of property falling now into the hands of African Americans who, just 10 years out of slavery, were actually purchasing it from their former owners. So, you know, that was part of the point of that second burning. And then again, there are like 2 or 3 more. And from what I understand, it was reported that there wasn't much loss in those actual burnings. So again, when you go into a county, you know, the records vary from county to county. I would highly recommend that if you are able to travel, go physically see, what's there and handle it. Everything is not digitized and everything is not online. And then there are other means, like I said, if you're researching the neighboring county, the McIntosh County lines, actually were changed a couple of times, really to help, with gerrymandering and voting issues. So you do find records of people, especially in northern McIntosh, in Liberty County. So there are options, and of course there are newspapers. Newspapers are the one record that I don't think anybody really utilizes, to the fullest. But there are a lot of hints in newspapers that propose where you can go, and I actually had one in the newsletter this month where we have a researcher that was researching Brooks County and had the ad that pointed right back to McIntosh County. So again, use every tool available. Family Search, if cost is an issue, has digitized a number of records. They don't necessarily have them all indexed at this point. They tend to get around to it, but there are a lot of great probate wills and other records that really would help to identify our enslaved ancestors that were held as property in the documents of their owners.
That's wonderful to really tie together what we've been talking about with DNA with the need to also do the documentary research. Because they have to go together, of course.
Yeah, they're hand in hand and they support each other.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could add one quick thing, one of the things that I've noticed as I've been reaching out to new DNA matches, and again, it all depends on your comfort level, is that if you have not downloaded your information from Ancestry and uploaded them to, say, a Family Tree DNA, a MyHeritage, or a GEDmatch, if you're going to maintain your research in the Ancestry world, there's nothing wrong with it. Your life is just going to be a lot more difficult. In that, one of the things that you're really going to have to do is, collaborate. And as a part of that collaboration, you are going to need to share your DNA match list with other researchers. And again, I would focus in on serious researchers that you feel comfortable with, because that's one of the things that I've been on a couple of conference calls, and towards the end, I'm trying to, as I'm listening, it's like I can hear that it's obvious to me they have not shared their match lists with each other, because as we're asking questions about how many shared centimorgans, I'm jotting them down. And so once we kind of have that at the end, I kind of raise my hand, hey, how about sharing your match list to potentially make a little bit easier for you guys. And once we started down that road and they could see the matches from the other person's perspective, it kind of blew them away because they had not even considered that. So if you are going to stay in the Ancestry world, I would highly recommend developing that collaboration and actually sharing your match list so other people can look at your match list, because chances are they'll see something that you don't necessarily recognize, or someone that they've already maybe done a skeleton tree for and can help you out. So that was just the one thing that I wanted to throw out there. And again, I don't know the level of everyone that's on the call, but that's one thing that I've found that people have not really taken advantage of, on Ancestry.
Well said. And sharing, I can't emphasize the importance of that if you're really trying to make these connections by sharing your match list. I get more out of viewing your match list than I do out of looking at your actual tree. And you'll see too, I don't maintain a tree online. But that said, I look at it and I start to work back organically versus the trees, because a lot of people are finding, and there's tons of forums that are talking about this, but a lot of the trees are full of errors. And it's become a real impediment to doing African-American research specifically, because people tend to just copy these errors and they continue spreading them. And if you do the deep dive and you try to adhere to good genealogy practices and standards, you will eventually see that it's impossible. But unfortunately, we have a whole community hanging their hat in one place, and that's where I think we're now getting in our way and creating our own brick walls, because then it's hard for people to let go of what they perceive to be, a correct family pedigree.
I think Deborah has a question.
To piggyback on Terry talking about available records, you might also want to check with the Daughters of the American Revolution. They have a lot of records, and as a member, that is when I found out that there's a lot of history that that these daughters had, not only at the revolutionary period of time, but going forward. And so you might want to check that too. And the other comment I wanted to make is, when we talk about trees being online, especially Ancestry, a lot of that information that people put on the trees is incorrect. And if you are a novelist or you're ignorant to how it all works, looking for research, you're going to go with that, and you're going to go down rabbit holes.
Right. You're absolutely right. And I do think it's becoming very problematic. And what concerns me, especially as AI comes in, because essentially you have a computer generating an algorithm, and they'll find this cluster of people that all say they go back to, say, William the Conqueror, and it's incorrect. And then they're passing it along, as viable, information. And like I said, I've actually talked to other researchers that kind of get stuck because they're going to stand by the information that they've had, when the DNA is really pointing you in a whole other direction. So again, like I said, that's why I prefer to just kind of look at the match list. I'll roll up my sleeves and I'll do the work and figure out the connection. That's there. It's the one sure thing. It's there. But we have to be meticulous. We have to take the time to document more precisely. And again, I'm guilty of that myself, because when I started out, I had no idea that my interest would expand to the degree that it has. So even now, I'm going back now to cite properly and make certain that my work reflects the resources that I've encountered and used along the way. It's very, very important, to get that done, do the meticulous work, and sort through and correct these trees and get it right.
Thank you, Terry. Adolphus and Terry, thank you so much for being here. We just appreciate it so much. I know everybody here does. And I hope we can get together like this, have another chat like this sometime. And as I mentioned, I will send out an email to everybody who registered with a link to the recording, the chat, and the handout. Thank you all so much for coming, and just have a great rest of your Sunday afternoon.